Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. This is Cloud Secrets brought to you by Azure User Group Denmark. My name is Marilag Dimatulak. I'm one of the organizer of Azure DK. And today we have a very special guest. He's a program manager at Microsoft, and he's going to teach us all things open source at MS. And I'm really excited. But before we proceed to the actual talk, I just want to walk you through what we have for this event. So please remember that today we are giving out some swags to you who is actively participating in our event today. We have the Azure Heroes Learner Badge, which you can see here, and you can claim later. And then we also have some prizes for if you ask questions, and then if you also find the secret word that Mikkel is going to be showing in his presentation today. And this event is brought to you by Microsoft and also Device. And please support our group, and you can find us in Twitter, in Meetup, and also in YouTube. So if you are in Denmark right now, I hope you're really enjoying this summer day. Maybe you're on your way to your summer vacation, so I wish you will enjoy that. But otherwise, if you are anywhere in the world, I hope you will enjoy Open Source Secrets with Mikkel Mørk Hegnhøj. So let's welcome Mikkel on the stage here. Hi, Mikkel.
Hi, and thanks for having me.
Well, thank you for joining us today. We're really excited about your talk about open source. Personally, I'm also a developer. I work a lot with Azure, so I'm sure I'm going to learn a lot from you today. You are based in Denmark, right?
That is correctly, yes.
Yeah. Are you going on vacation anytime soon, or?
I am for another week and a half, then I'm off for 3 weeks.
So, yeah. That's nice. Traveling anywhere in particular, or just staying in the country?
Staying in the country, but well, traveling inside the country. So yeah, gonna see parts of Denmark I've never visited before.
That's a good idea. I was also doing that, like this whole during the pandemic. We've been to different islands in Denmark and just try to see the parts of the country you won't normally do if it wasn't for the pandemic, which is a good thing.
Yeah, there's so many islands to see in Denmark, right? You could easily fill up a few summer vacations with that, I assume.
I'm also pleasantly surprised. Not that I did not expect it, but it's really beautiful country. So yeah, there's more to see. All right, so I'm going to give you the stage and have fun. And for those of you watching our show, don't forget to catch the cloud secret word in one of Mikkel's presentation to get a chance to win some swags from Microsoft. All right, Mikkel.
Cool, thank you. So let me transition over to presentation here. So hi everyone, and thanks for joining here today. My name is Mikkel Mørk Hegnhøj, and I'm a program manager in the Azure Dev Compute team within Microsoft. What that means is that I'm part of the engineering organization building some of the Azure products that I guess a lot of you may know, things like app services, functions, logic apps, among others. I'm just forgetting the whole range of things we have inside our group right now. That's what the group that I currently work in mainly concerned with. I have been within Microsoft for the last 10 years, and 5 of those years I spent in product teams, both in the developer division, doing development tooling for Azure, and also in the Azure Core Compute team, doing different core compute services such as Service Fabric, Azure Kubernetes services, amongst other stuff. So as we go along with this presentation, I can see comments coming in. So if you have any questions or things coming up, feel free to just add a comment. And I'm pretty sure I would be able to see it off of my screen, and hopefully I can pick that up and answer to whatever questions you guys may have. So today we're going to talk about Microsoft and open source and how we love open source software. I think this is by now well known to a lot of people. But I wanted to go through a little bit of, brief history of where we are, latest news in the open source, what's the perspective we have today from within Microsoft in terms of engaging, contributing and using open source, both in our own products and technologies and services, but also how being part of a community, some of our learnings and how we want to give back, to others about that. And then I'm going to walk through, I picked up a bunch of open source projects that I find fairly interesting. Some which relates to being a developer, some relating to the more, DevOpsy kind of things relating to running large-scale systems or just running systems as such. And by the end, I have a little bit about, things to consider in this whole space of open sourcing and what it means. So we know, as I said, we love open source software. Just to give a little bit of perspective of timeline and how this has been an important part of Microsoft for quite many years. Back in 2004, we started by open sourcing our Wix installer, and you can see there's a reference here to some of the Wikipedia article that has some fairly detailed insights about this. But at least I wanted to highlight a lot of the things that I know a lot of developers have been using or utilizing along the way, how we established CodePlex as a place to share code and started doing Linux kernel contributions, open sourcing the .NET Micro framework, to introducing Git support and going down this path where Git and later on GitHub has become sort of center or cornerstones within how we engage in open source and an open source community. So back in this is almost 10 years ago, we introduced Git support across CodePlex, and for those of you who remember, Team Foundation Server as well. And of course, the bigger one with open sourcing .NET 7 years ago in, releasing a thing like VS Code, the acquisition of GitHub, later on the acquisition of NPM last year, which it's funny because it's one of those things that apparently few people missed that we did, but NPM is also now part of Microsoft and part of what we operate and what we offer to the community. And another interesting twist, this is one of these things where you can poke at Microsoft and maybe, with a smile on, that Microsoft also became the largest non-Google contributor to the Chromium project, and it's obviously because of the new Edge browser, that we released. Probably last year. I think we released it in a GA version. And a few other interesting things, I think, like the Surface Duo, this hardware device, the foldable, not phone, but more like tablet-ish, iPad-ish, mini-ish thingy, which was an Android-based device. And how, recent announcement around Windows 11, where you see things like Android apps being able to run on Windows 11, while also having the WSL, the Windows subsystem for Linux, which means you have this weird developer workstation, I would say. I saw someone depict this on Twitter the other day, where they had a Microsoft. Apparently, Microsoft is an elephant, but then it had the Linux Tux head on top, and I think it had Android feeds or something like that. It was a funny cartoon. It's a weird thing to think about, how in that one operating system now you want Android-based apps on a Windows operating system that has a Linux subsystem that you can also use. So I think that kind of melding things together is how we also, taking in and giving opportunities to tap into these communities. And the CBL Mariner is our own Microsoft Linux distribution that we also open sourced last year. And a few things I had to add to this slide just here recently is, if we look at what's happening just this year, is, we joined the Rust Foundation back in February, meaning that, our engagement into even these programming languages other than the C# and what else is around .NET is also a commitment we have. And another interesting thing, which is still, it's still sort of it's a fairly new initiative, but it's a different thinking around some of this open source, I would say, where, Microsoft has teamed up with Bosch, a German electronics company. I would say it's sort of a conglomerate. They make a lot of different stuff, but they do a lot of tier one parts or commodity parts to the auto industry. And basically, Microsoft and Bosch have teamed up to try to define what a software-defined vehicle platform would look like for automakers. But we've done it, or we are doing it in a way where a lot of the stuff we will produce and develop within this project is aimed at open source, at open sourcing. So you could say there are even considerations around these very specific industry initiatives where we might build platforms or build those kind of solutions that with the aim of open sourcing, because we think that there are a lot of these types of solutions where the solution itself becomes a commodity. That's not the differentiator in terms of business value that anyone can bring. So that's a different perspective. It's not, open sourcing is not just about sort of the core technologies anymore, or the technologies that developers use. It might also be, even platforms beyond that. So that was a little bit about how we engaged, and how we engaging in the different open source software projects. But there's also how we love the open source community, which is a different angle to this. And Sarah Novotny, who is our open source lead in the Azure office of the CTO, Sarah has played a crucial role in her previous job of bootstrapping the whole Kubernetes community while she worked at Google. So she has some experience and some tenure in terms of what it means to open source these projects and how to really create communities. And she recently, this was back in January, so it's not that recent anymore, but back in January, she wrote about, some of the open source lessons that she would like to, bring forward into 2021. And I think it's a good article to sum up some of the states of, where we as Microsoft see this thing, the learnings we have and some initiatives we've taken. And I especially like this quote from the article about how it has how open source has changed the tech company collaboration, and that it's now an accepted model for collaborating. At one point in time there was the usual collaboration around defining standards and specifications that anyone can go and do a proprietary implementation of. But it really seems like that we sort of skipped that whole thing and just went straight ahead to some degree to implementing it. But the implementation or the definition of what it is that we build happens as we implement this in these communities. Now, the 4 things that she called out in this article, the first one is about, how with engaging in communities and how when we build new technology, we do it around an open source community, is that enables us to easily seek these different perspectives that really ends up making the software better. So we go and engage with community, right? Early adopters, like things we, of course, did in the past as well while we were developing proprietary software. But when this happens in the open and with the engagement, like there are opportunities for collaborating even on the source code itself. And she has an example in the article about how some of the community engagement involvement we did changed some of the roadmaps around Dapper, the distributed application runtime, which is an open source project that Microsoft is incubating. So, and I would say, from my own experience, it's actually been quite a while since I've been involved in product development in my current job, where it wasn't open sourced. Like I spend more time looking at code that's in public GitHub than I spend looking at code that's in Microsoft closed repositories in our own stuff that we have. And I think actually a lot of people feel that way today, has the same experience at working in Microsoft. So just, it's a real thing. It's what we do. And if you engage with any of the Azure services teams today, you see there's a huge engagement on GitHub. Even though that not everything is necessarily open source, there's still a huge engagement and trying to drive a community around that. The second thing that she calls out in this article is about how we as a company have been through this process of adopting open source and in many ways, right? It's not just about how we are using open source within our own products, because we are a lot. It's also how we, incubate new or, help establish new open source projects, and how, how we allow our employees to contribute to open source projects that, we eventually use. And so we've done our set of learnings in terms of how we need to find that right balance between policy and autonomy in terms of adopting and engaging in these open source communities. And we've actually developed a set of guidance and tooling. And again, there's reference from this blog that talks about how you as a company or in your companies things to be aware of and things to consider going down the path of adopting open source in any of these scenarios. The third thing to call out is about security and open source. Like we've seen how, even in open source software, there are risks of having security or having some of the software being exploited maliciously. And so one of the initiatives that Microsoft then engaged in, and I think this is together with at least IBM, I think Google is also part of it, and a few other companies as well, is to build this open source security foundation, or OpenSSF, which is aimed at providing tools and guidance for open source projects to help stay secure or provide secure software. I know this is not an OpenSSF thing per se, but if you think about how the Dependabot feature on GitHub works and how you can get notified when there are known security vulnerabilities and dependencies that you may have inside your code, I think those are some of the mechanisms that we want to have in there, so that if you build a product and you go and rely on open source components, like the liability of those open source components being secure is not necessarily on you as a consumer, but there's a way where that community maintaining the open source project have tools and guidelines that sort of help you, check off the box of saying, I'm confident the processes and procedures are being followed, so that this open source project actually produces secure software, secure binary for me to use. And the last thing is about communications. And she has this parallel to how the pandemic showed a lot of us about working remotely. As you can see, I'm working from home. I'm actually doing that. Also did that before the pandemic. But what she talks about in this article is also how some of these communities have always done that. Like if you spend a lot of your time in any open source project or open source community, you are well versed in the having meetings online and not necessarily meeting in person unless there's a conference or some kind of gathering where that enables you to do that. But maybe the people you work the most together with are not even in the same company as you, which means that you couldn't even meet in an office. So there are some learnings from that open source communities can maybe bring. And she especially points out the thing that Kubernetes, which is built in this virtual space, like there is no Kubernetes office, right? But it's also a massive community that has grown to 407 chat channels, and I'm pretty sure if you think about Slack channels in this case, all being part of the communication streams in creating that project. And it's interesting to think about how you do that and how you think about communication in those projects with so many people, distributed across many places, have to collaborate. Okay, so let's dive a little bit into some of these examples of open source projects that I think are interesting that Microsoft has been providing. And all of these can be found on our opensource.microsoft.com page, which basically is a sort of a gateway to a lot of the all this open source stuff that we do. So this is sort of a few things I picked out that are interested for sort of being a developer or your developer workstation. The first one is PowerToys, which is basically a great set of utilities to streamline your Windows experience. And it's interesting because I just recently started trying out the new Windows 11, and there's a ton of stuff from PowerToys that they actually adopted in Windows 11. But it's for those who know Scott Hanselman, and I guess a lot of people do, it's one of the things that he's been very adamant about promoting, and how you can ease screen layouts, how you can quickly search. I think there's a package installer as part of this as well for Windows. So if you're on a Windows workstation, this is a good place to pick up on how to customize and streamline your developer setup on Windows. And again, think about these and always keep in mind, it's open source. You can contribute. If there are things you think are missing, features you want to have in there, these projects might be good places to go and engage. The next one is Windows Terminal, which is our native terminal, not a shell, but basically the terminal that can hook into your WSL, into your PowerShell, and all these kind of things. Just gives you a nice integrated experience when you're on Windows as well. of having all these different or addressing all these different subsystems or things that you run. I would say, on my machine, it's interesting that I use the browser and I use the Windows terminal. That is probably all I use. And that terminal is being hooked up either to a Linux subsystem or to some remote containers, and eventually there's a little bit of PowerShell going on as well. But you can see how these things sort of form the experience of Windows 11 as well, where you start to combining the operating system and everything. And bear in mind, the terminal is not a shell. Like, look at PowerShell as well. PowerShell is also open source today. So, I mean, PowerShell is not just a Windows thing anymore. It's a thing that can be used and run across Linux and Windows and Mac and everything. And integrating it with the Windows terminal, again, you have a great way to customize and, make your own developer machine experience to really just be more productive to what it is that you have to deal with in your day-to-day job. For .NET developers, I want to highlight Project Thai. Thai is really a thing that the .NET team did to sort of experiment. It's still an experimental project today, but they want to find a way to ease development, testing, and deployment of distributed application, typically microservices architectures, so that when you move, or when you're on your developer workstation and you need to connect a bunch of services together or spin new services up, I mean, how do you don't have orchestration features like you would normally have if running in, let's say, in a Kubernetes cluster, for instance. So how do you do things like naming resolution? How do you call across services? How do you easily deploy all these together, figure out dependencies between services, and so on and so forth? And Project Thai is then a .NET-centric view on this, and works really, really well if you're on the .NET ecosystem. So definitely go check that out if you're into microservices and distributed apps, and of course if you're into .NET as well. And finally, Blazor for building web apps in C#. The WebAssemblies of the .NET world, or how to bring that into any browsers. Interrupt with JavaScript, just make like web development nice, especially if you come from a C# world or C# programming set of skills. So those were the 4 things I wanted to highlight on the developer workstation as projects. When we talk about being on the way, like on the way to the cloud or to whoever's data center or on the way to production, I've picked out these 3 open source projects that I wanted to just briefly touch on. First one is the Cloud Native Application Bundle, or CNAP. And together with that, Porter. Those are 2 different, they're 2 different projects. But so CNAP being a specification and Porter being an implementation of Cloud Native Application Bundles. And the problem that CNAP and Porter are meant to solve is being able to take concepts of immutable deployment packages and immutable deployment practices literally to anything. Like, if you think about how you would deploy a container today, where you have like a remote registry where actually the binaries and the packages are being kept, and when you want to run that, you go and tell your runtime platform, your orchestrator or service, whatever it is, that hey, I want to run one of those, and those being that package, that immutable thing defined, the finished build of your thing, and there's some configuration you inject. And basically, the platform goes and pulls the package, wraps it, unwraps it, and runs it based on the configuration you give it. That's really what we do with containers today. And CNAP can do that with anything, basically because it packages, your container, your install scripts, and everything. No, sorry, not your containers. Your binaries, your install script, and all those things in a container. I've recently been through some projects where we did this with, something like a single web API with a relational database you want to run inside Azure, where you run host your web API and app services. The database is in a managed, one of our managed database services. So it could be Postgres, it could be Azure SQL. But by utilizing CNAPs to do the actual deployment and installation of these, we could create these immutable packages where I could just literally all I had to provide was a subscription ID and credentials. And I could just, stamp out environments of this web API with the database and everything by doing that. I found this extremely useful because I think from a from an application delivery point of view, that part of DevOps, this just changes a lot of things of how you see stage progression, how you can solve those things, ad hoc environment provisioning and those kind of things. So definitely worth checking out. Spent quite some time on this, and it's really interesting. If you want to explain this in a few words, it's like an MSI installer, but for the cloud, right? So install scripts, binaries, carries everything, can install anything anywhere. Accessibility Insights is another interesting open source project. And this is really about how, I think the origination of the project is that we've made a huge push over the last 5 years or so, I would say, with inside Microsoft in terms of making all our products and technologies more and more accessible. And you've probably seen things like, the adaptive Xbox controller, I think is a very specific outcome of that initiative. But there are other things we do in terms of how we do transcription inside Teams, how we do automated translation and you don't call them subtitles, but since most of you guys are from Denmark, you know what I mean. The closed captures, like we can do that in different languages, even as we live stream things. So all these things that just make content and technology more accessible to people who have different skill sets or any disabilities or anything that they have to that sometimes might hinder them for being able to use these things. So Accessibility Insight is really an automated testing framework for web development. So it has support for for WebKit, Chromium, and a bunch of other rendering engines. And by using Accessibility Insights, both as a not headless, as a UI to go and inspect your websites and web pages for any accessibility in compliances. I think there's an accessibility compliance standard called WAGCCG, something like that we can check against. But it also has the ability to do this in pipelines. So really have automated testing for accessibility problems in your UI. I think it's a very, very powerful thing. And it's one of these things, like when we have these great tools and automated solutions, it becomes so much easier for anyone to work with. And the last one on this side is Playwright, which is another web automation tool. And Playwright is really about load testing websites. It's a Node.js library that you can go and pick up from the GitHub page and other places, and basically start automating all your websites and do load testing against them. And there's a very simple and single API to go ahead and do that. So Accessibility Insights and Playwrights are things that hook good into the web UI environment. So my last category of these open source projects is, I don't know, I call this running. This was about, now we're in production. Anyway, I just needed to categorize them because I had 3 slides. I guess that's the main takeaway here. But first of all, just the Azure SDKs that we provide are all open sourced. So you can go and engage in those as well. Like if you see problems with the SDKs, if there are things that you miss while using those SDK against the Azure APIs, it's all open source. And I think this is where the idea of community and the idea of having customers or users engage is prevalent there. I think the Azure SDKs, I know a lot of them are actually auto-generated. There is some human interaction in creating these, but at least we've set this out in a way so that we cater to engagement in a way where we can get the direct feedback even on code or whatever it may be. Virtual Kubelet is another one. This is one of the projects I've been involved in as well. And Virtual Kubelet, for those who know Kubernetes, Kubelet is let's call it the agent, the worker node agent within the Kubernetes setup. Basically, you have an API server sort of the core, the brain of a Kubernetes cluster, and then you have kubelets that are agents running on each of these, the nodes that actually bridge between the API and the container runtimes that eventually runs your containers on the nodes. And the virtual kubelet project is about creating a kubelet that doesn't represent or is not installed on a specific node, but just represents an arbitrary compute layer, or you could say an arbitrary container runtime. That container runtime could be Azure Container Instances, or it could be AWS Fargate, or it could be any other container instance provider or container provider, so to speak. So Virtual Kubelet has had this idea of how can you use those kind of services or other scenarios to, as backend or as the actual, processing or compute that you add into a Kubernetes cluster. So the Virtual Kubelet project has a lot of different implementations, provider implementations, where you can go and hook these in. So basically, you can build some interesting scenarios where you might have a centralized Kubernetes setup, an API server, but through the Virtual Kubelet, you can actually bridge out the workloads to different regions, to different cloud providers, different on-prem installations you might have, and that way you can start creating some HA scenarios. So it's fairly cool and fairly simple technology that I urge if you're in the Kubernetes world to go and take a look at. The third one here is Dapper. I mentioned that earlier as part of one of these things where we've seen a lot of customer or community engagement. That was a typical Microsoft fault, if anyone picked that up. Customers and communities become the same to a certain degree. But anyways, the distributed application runtime, as Dapper is, like the way that we talked about TIE helping .NET developers in building microservices applications or distributed applications, what Dapper is sort of like a programming language framework agnostic way of running these distributed event-driven resilient applications anywhere. So Dapper is a runtime that typically in a container setup will go and inject proxies or sidecars to your container workloads, and through those sidecars provide a set of building blocks for building distributed applications. So one scenario is to inject something like access to state or secrets, where there's through the Dapper SDK, there's a canonical way to go and get a secret. Basically, from within your code, you can call an endpoint a Dapper endpoint. And say, hey, give me a secret, and that secret then surfaces to you independently on whatever implementation you have on the other side to actually store that secret. So let's say if you're in Azure and your secret is stored in Key Vault, the Dapper runtime would just be configured in a way that it knows that secrets are stored in Key Vault. So when anyone goes and asks for secret, Dapper can do that translation as an intermediary between your code and the actual secret store implementation. Now, if it's a HashiCorp vault that you run on-prem or in Azure or anywhere else, Dapper can do the same translation. So basically, your code doesn't have to change based on what kind of implementation you use to back that. And so Dapper has this set of building blocks. There are things for secret management, there are state store, I think there's caching, things like remote method invocation, and lots of other things that you see are common patterns or common things that you need to use in these distributed applications environments. Dapper recently went V1. I think they're already 1.1. They move pretty fast. But go and check that out as well. And finally, we have Crosslet, which is, so we talked about the kubelet before in Kubernetes, which is the worker node agent. Crosslet is obviously written in Rust since it's called KRust, whatever. These naming things are interesting. But what Crosslets can do is it works the same way as a kubelet, but its job is not to bridge to container runtime. Its job is to be able to run WebAssemblies. So it's sort of a very early experimentation in terms of if you want to have orchestration and distribution of compute execution, but you don't want to have it in form of a container or an OCI compliant container implementation, then WebAssembly implementations are also an option. And the scenarios here typically go through low compute units, so IoT scenarios and things like that, where container runtimes are really too heavy to run. And there's another open source project that sort of go together with that, I would say, sort of, called Acri, which is about how you can do automatic device discovery within a Kubernetes cluster. So basically, the idea is next to a kubelet, you have this Acri agent sitting, and there are some protocols to automatically discover IoT devices. I don't remember the name of all of that, but imagine that you plug in a security camera in a network, and this agent can discover it through some kind of, it's not universal plug and play, but I guess you sort of kind of get the idea here. It can discover these things, and those resources can then be controlled within a Kubernetes resource definition concept. And so there are some of these projects that are interesting if you're in this space of IoT management, small device things, and how it all works together with distributed things and orchestration, like in the Kubernetes ecosystem. Okay, so that was a run through a bunch of open source projects to give you a little bit of inspiration and go and look at it, and also give you an idea of the diversity and stuff that we are doing at Microsoft or engaging in. Now, how can you engage in stuff we engage, or how can we engage together, I guess, is the question I'm trying to answer with this slide. Well, opensourcemicrosoft.com/collaborate. Go and take a look. It's funny. We built it sort of like a, what do you call that? A newsline ticker, where whenever someone raises an issue or pull request, there's a new thing coming up, and it just goes so fast because we have so many projects today. I think we were supposed that we wanted to show that a heartbeat kind of we're alive, but now it's just like it doesn't make sense because so many things are happening. But you can see that at least if you go to collaborate. And we also try to compile, if you want to be engaged, what's a good first issue in any of these projects, and so on and so forth. But go and check that out. And also, I want to highlight this, the FOSS fund that we have. So something we call Microsoft's Free and Open Source Software Fund. Again, there's a link where you can go and check that out. The gist of this is that every month, Microsoft put out a prize of $10,000 that we will donate to a open source project. And the way that we do that is that Microsoft employees go and nominate these projects. Of course, you cannot have a project that is run by a Microsoft employee that is part of this, but other projects that we either use or engaged in or contribute to, but that we don't maintain or own in any kind, we can nominate. And then there's this, I think every month, if you as a Microsoft employee has been partaking in any open source engagement, or just contributing or whatever, you get to vote, and then someone is being donated this. And there's a few interesting things like NTP, one of these, like the network time protocol, I guess it is, network time server protocol, something like that, actually got one of these donations. ILSpy, so again, if you're into .NET, they got a donation as well. ESLint for JavaScript linting was another project. And there are these two. These were actually very interesting when I read about them. Something called Hikaya and Shine. And what I like about those projects, and also why I highlight them here, is again to show a little bit of a different perspective of open source. I think, at least in my mind, and I think that's more of like the dominant thinking, is open sourcing is about building technology for technologists. We build the development tools open source, we build our frameworks open source, we build our platforms open source that we can use. But these things are really, I don't know what you call it, higher level user kind of trending things. One of them, Hikaya, is about how you can support nonprofits, or enable nonprofit organizations to, do a data-driven storytelling. And Shine is about how to help, women experience abuse, really find information and support they need, whether it's about, how to get help, or, PII data that needs to be, found on the internet or something like that. But those are actually other types of open source projects that I think are interesting to just highlight that they actually do exist. And And if you know the $10,000 donation, the easiest way for us to cash out this money is through a thing like GitHub sponsoring, right? So what we typically end up doing is we end up being GitHub sponsors towards maintainers of open source projects. So if you are engaged anywhere, you know, find a friendly Microsoft employee in your neighborhood and go and, you know, have them help nominate your project to the FOSS fund, and I'll definitely be happy to help doing that. So feel free to reach out if you guys are engaged and your project is in need of money, and we can definitely do that. Okay, so I think this is sort of like ending on a little bit more of a thoughtfulness note. I wanted to do here is, you know, when we think about open source, at least at one point, we heard a lot of, before it became more or less the standard of how we collaborate across technology companies and things like that, which I think is more like the trend today. There's always been this conversation about, well, open source is good because I'm not locked into a particular vendor. And that is right, given that, you know, that open source technology that you use is being, you know, either maintained by multiple vendors or being, you know, being provided as a service by multiple vendors. You know, and then there are probably scenarios where that's not true, even though that it is an open source technology. So I think there are nuances to this whole discussion about login and how, you know, using open source doesn't necessarily mean you're not logged in. So a guy called Gregor Hope, I would assume that's how you pronounce his name, wrote this article. It's a few years old, but I keep coming back to it because it's just it's an awesome perspective. And what he does in this article is he talks about, he actually lists 7 different types of login. And of course, you know, technology choice is one of them, but other things like, you know, skill, the type of skill set that you have, is a different set of login. Like if, you know, if you only hire people who can do C#, or if you only hire people who are, you know, who are good at building microservice application, you probably end up having a C# based microservice application, right? But those are also, so, you know, the logins are the decisions you make, and, you know, you need to do some serious considerations as to whether, you know, the potential cost of being logged in, you know, as he described, well, the price of a login is the cost of unlocking, like basically getting out of jail from that login, you know, factored by the chance that you have, you know, the risk of any in a situation where you want to do that. And he has this example where it's like, well, if there's a 5% chance that you want to change your database technology, for instance, and the cost of that migration is $100,000, well, then the login costs you $20,000. So, you know, you have that number and you can look at, okay, how, you know, what would I have to do today to, how costful would it be for me to, you know, either use an open source database technology, and then maybe I had to go and hire, you know, people who had those skills, or I had to go and upskill my people to use that database technology, or, you know, would I have to use a specific ORM framework, and would I lose, you know, performance or scalability by doing that, or something like that. So you can do those kind of cost benefit analysis, and there's actually a lot of logins that are reasonable choices to make. So it gives you a great perspective on this, and when open source, you know, prevents login, when it doesn't really do that. And then I just want to throw that in there as a consideration. And another learning that we had, and again, this is a few years back, we did some studying around startups, where the intention from our side was, of course, to figure out how did we position Microsoft in the best way to capture, you know, startups. Basically saying, you know, at a certain point when a startup like just starts to exponentially grow, how can we, you know, how can we ensure they land up on our, using our technologies, being a customer of ours, basically. And there were some pretty interesting observations we did in that as part of that project. So we had this, like, there were 2 generic phases that we talked about. One of them is like, you know, startups are either in what we call the product market fit cycle, or they move to this growth phase. There's sort of an inflection point between these 2 that are interesting. So when you're in a product market fit cycle, it's all about, you know, you might have a business idea, you build some technology to support it, but then you figure out the business idea wasn't exactly the thing I built. It's actually like a little bit like to this side or that side or whatever. I have a different, customer target or whatever it is. And as long as you were in that cycle, there was like constant churn. And some of the things we noticed was that, what was so important is like, the time to reiterate was so much more important than being able to scale and be reliable in the tech stack that you ran. That was a concern that sort of came later. Whenever these guys had to change things, Git push origin master, nothing, branching technology or branching strategies and stuff like that, just too expensive. Like, don't even think about it. Like, if we had scenarios where customers would flip the whole tech stack for their solution, just like within a week, because, they had to change their product to something else. They had, great benefit of going over using this or reuse some component that someone written, and then, boom, they were on a different tech stack. So, extremely cost sensitive and very time sensitive, and, minimal investment loyalty to what they did. But then this inflection point came in where, they started utilizing best of breed, and they had to start optimizing for economics of scale and in terms of perf and reliability and things. So, there are different concerns that come in as they move into the growth phase. And what was interesting is like it was very hard to foresee when that inflection point happened, which means that to a large degree, a lot of these startups ending having totally random tech stacks. Like, there was no plan. Like, no one built a startup saying, we want to build a startup and we want to, build it on Java or .NET or whatever. It's always like, oh, we hit the head on the nail. We need to grow. Are we developing in Java? Oh, apparently we are, because that's what we changed to last week. Let's continue from there. And, so I think going back to the login and those considerations and thinking about, also what makes time in terms of making these decisions as your product, where you are in your product development sort of life cycle on, are you trying to figure out what you're actually going to build? Have you figured out what to support, and now you need to be more considerate about best of breed? And that, going back to those logins and those decisions that you make, I think these two tie together in terms of how the outcome can be. Okay, so that was my end note of trying to take the open sourcey all the way from Microsoft history, stuff we're doing today, how we see open source and use open source, walk you through a bunch of projects, and then a little bit about all these considerations, open source or not. I don't think actually that's a question today as much. This is like, how do you make these choices, good or bad? And maybe just open source, let's just factor that out, because it's just another decision point in all these other decisions points we have to make. So I think we have a little quiz that we have to do here at the end. I don't know, Magla, do you have anything you want to say before I just?
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you very much. That was very, very insightful, Mikkel. So yeah, I also have a couple of questions for discussion, but we can do that later. You can start with the quiz, and let's see if someone from the audience can answer your questions. And then at the end, if any of you has spotted our secret word, then please post it on the chat. And the first one who I see from my side, because I don't know. Unfortunately,
it's an eventual
consistency. Exactly. So it depends on
I don't think
which server you're hitting. Unfortunately, but whoever posts it first, from my view, wins the prize. So we can start with your quiz, Mikkel. I think it's okay that we're like this. It's pretty readable, right? Yeah.
Okay. I was tasked to ask 2 questions, and I did like old school teacher kind of way. So did you listen? And if you listened along, you should be able to answer these questions. So first question is, name one of the open source projects that have received funding from the Microsoft Foundation. Of Microsoft funds.
I even took note of that. I wrote it, but I'm not going to answer. Anybody? Anybody from the audience? You should probably give them a couple of seconds. Right.
By the way, what's the prizes here?
Oh,
What's on
some
stake?
swags. So we have some code that you can claim. There's a website where you can claim these swags, and you can get it delivered right to your doorstep. So I think I'm gonna check with Sherry, um, and how it works, or what exactly is in the swag. But I think it's actually a surprise.
Okay,
So you log
cool.
onto this website with this code, and then I think you put your address there, and it will be delivered to you.
I do see someone replying here. I think Peter Kaspersen, he
Wrote
made a bet.
NTP.
Yeah, that's right. NTP is one of them. I think the other ones that I mentioned was I Spy, Iceland, Hikaya, and Shine.
Yeah,
Oh, he said that he arrived late. But
that's
anyway,
okay.
it was the right answer. I haven't seen any
Yay.
other answers. Oh, okay. So the next question. And yeah, that's right. Simon, Home Assistant did also receive, even though I didn't mention it. But you can go and look it up in the Fast Fund side. And again, reach out if you guys are involved and you want to get some help being nominated. Next question, also question number 1, I guess. How many chat rooms does the Kubernetes community have? And I mentioned this, and it was at the time the OSS blog that I talked about from Sarah Novotny. So let's say plus minus 10% for correct answer. Does anyone remember?
Take a wild guess, people. I think that's one I missed when I was tweeting your your session, Mikkel.
So we are in the hundreds, at least. I can say.
Wow. Oh my gosh. That's a lot of chat rooms to maintain.
Yeah,
Eh,
I guess that's one of the points. Like, they are not being maintained; they are self-maintained.
okay. Yeah.
Right? Some of these
Yeah.
communities are more engaged than others.
Yeah. Anybody? Just take a wild guess. It's in the hundreds.
And you get a 10%. 105. It's not enough, Peter. We need to go higher.
He's at 125.
Yeah.
Higher. It's like
350. It's close, Nick. It's close. If we factor in the 10%, it's really close. I'm not gonna say higher or lower this time because it's gonna be. Fine. So Tomic is right. 397. I think the number that I pulled off of her blog were 407. So 397 is within the 10%. So I think Tomica is gonna be the winner of that one. But anyway, yeah, that's a lot of chat channels and a lot of things to pick up on if you go out on a 3-week vacation. I'm pretty sure no one does. And then I guess the last thing was the secret word. Did anyone pick up the secret word on one of the slides? I mean, it wasn't that secret, but there was a small graphics that we put in that had a secret word.
Yes. Let's see. Some people are scrubbing your video right now on YouTube.
Oh, you can go back.
Yes. Let's see. We can give a clue. It's part of the title of this event. Not Mikkel's talk, but this event. If you remember the title of this event, that is. So many things to remember. Anybody? Well, it's not just the title of this event, it's the whole point of this event. Yay! I think we have a winner. Let me see. Do we see the same name,
There it is.
Mikkel?
I see both Tomica and Peter.
Yeah.
But I guess
think,
since yeah.
So I think both of them already has
they both
has
of
a
them.
code. Yeah.
There you go. They have been paying a lot of attention.
Thank you very much for that participation. I think I can give you the 2 codes, so you get double double swag. What's better than a single swag, but a double swag? So the way it works, I'll post my Twitter or email so that you don't have to give out your information. You only give it out to me, and then I can send you the code either on Twitter or via mail if you write me. So I'm just gonna post that on chat. You can reach me at Marilog on Twitter. Maybe Twitter is better. That's public.
I don't know. Yeah, I actually don't know if you ended up. Did you call me out in one of your tweets?
Yep, I did.
Okay, cool. Yeah. So anyone, if you have any questions or anything you want to follow up on, just reach out on Twitter, and I'll be happy to, reply.
Yeah, that's great. Do we have any questions? I have one. I actually have a 4, but for the interest of time, we have 3 minutes left.
Yeah, sure.
So
Go ahead.
I have one question, right? So how do you change the mindset of the people who's not really ready with using OSS? I know there are still some, especially maybe in enterprises, they're a bit more hesitant to jump into the OSS wagon. But especially because there are still folks who don't naturally associate Microsoft as an OSS-centric company, as you have mentioned. So all this list that you gave, fantastic list, but some people don't expect that, okay, this is actually from Microsoft. So how do you convince your boss to use this tool?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I'm pretty sure I don't have the answer, but I think a few things to at least consider is, and I talked about in that blog again that I called out, I think, some of this is, fear of compliance, taking in new teams, how we're going to audit, how we're going to be in control. I think for a lot of people, it's also going to be about support. Like, you pick up a dependency of someone and, what's the liability of introducing a security flaw in your product that came from an open source project and not from a vendor where you can call them and say, hey, vendor, go and fix this. So I think those are the things you need to work with and figure out. How do we have a model where we can actually, we have the predictability of when something happens, there is someone we can call. So, go and look at the guidelines we provided off of that blog in terms of how you can do those things and what you need to consider. So you have that good balance of policy and autonomy. And I think, there are all these all innovation happening in open source. It's where that's where it is. And I think by seeing how, we as a company engage in open source, the bets we are taking on it and everything, it's hard to find stuff. It's actually hard to use a service in Azure that doesn't use open source today. So I think maybe just even telling that story of, showing this presentation to your boss about what it is that we do might help, ease some of those kind of concerns.
Definitely. Thank you. And lastly, if you can name one favorite open source tool in your life, something you can't live without, what would that be if there's just one?
On a day-to-day basis, it's probably going to be VS Code. Like that's I don't know how I could do without what I would do. Probably just a bunch of Notepad instead. That's not even it's just for everything. Like, I don't know. It's actually quite funny. Like, one of the things is I had to use Visual Studio, good old proper Visual Studio the other day, and it was it's just been such a long time since I've been doing that. It also, to all, I'm not professionally developing on a day-to-day basis. I'm not producing stuff like, a real developer would do. I'm poking around, I'm doing stuff, but I'm working now and then as a developer. But I would say VS Code is just, it's just so easy. And especially recently with integration with GitHub code spaces, how I can transition between machines and I can just open up a VS Code anywhere randomly, and I can connect to a container hosted development environment from VS Code and just, I know the code space stuff is not the open source part, but VS Code as a tooling, I think that's the one that's most important to me right now.
I think I agree with you. It would be the same for me.
Yeah.
So Thank you very much, Mikkel. It has been really enlightening, and this video is on demand. So do share it to your colleagues, to your friends. It's going to be there forever, and there's a lot of things that you can. I think. Is there a way we can see all this list somewhere? Because I know we cannot click on the links on the
No, but let me
presentation.
see if I can, maybe I can add them in comments in the video. Would I be able to do
Yes,
that?
please.
Maybe I can do that.
Yes.
I can share the slides somewhere and I can put up a link to that. Let me figure
Yeah.
that one out.
Yeah, that would
Cool.
be nice because I would like the same. Thank you very much
Okay.
again, Mikkel, and
Yes, you're
thank you
welcome.
to everyone who watched. At the end of this show, I'm just going to display the QR code that you can use to earn your Azure Heroes Learner Badge. We have about 30, so if you're not watching live, you can still maybe claim one of those 30 badges when you watch it on your own time. So thank you very much and have a
Thanks
great
for
day,
joining.
everyone.
Bye
Bye.
bye.